When I talk about the death and resurrection of the Mass, and just give some views on it, and then leave time for questions, because I know yesterday the Q&A session I thought was quite dynamic. Obviously the quality of the questions is important, and if we've got the same people here as last night, questions should be fun. So I want to say, before I start anything else, something about beauty. Because we sometimes think beauty is an optional extra. And to me, one of the most difficult things to cope with is the Holy Liturgy done in a way which is, quite frankly, ugly, and with a sense of indifference, as if this doesn't really matter. At least that's what's conveyed when we don't bother to actually make the liturgy of the Church as beautiful as it is, integrity in its essence. So I want to say, first of all, about a little bit about the place of beauty. And the ancient Greek philosophers talked about the transcendentals, the good, the true, and the beautiful. And this was taken up, if you like, by Christian philosophers as being a mark of the Trinity. Right? This is a Trinitarian, a triune thing. That the good, the true, and the beautiful are not separable. Right? They are essentially triune. The three are one. So we can see perhaps the good, the true, and the beautiful. The good as being virtue or love. The true as being reason, and the beautiful being the beautiful, but the beautiful in the sense of involving our imaginations, and our imaginations is the presence of God's image in us, imagination. We can do what God does. God makes things out of nothing. We can't make things out of nothing. We make things from other things that already exist. But this partaking in God's creativity, in his creation, is part of the divine image in us, right? So unlike the other animals, we are able to love in a Christian sense, to freely choose to lay down our lives for the beloved. You see an image there in love and the liturgy immediately, I hope. But for a Christian, to love is a conscious, rational choice. It's not a feeling. Okay, the feeling in philosophical sense is accidental, because the feelings we have towards people will change. The feelings I have, I love my parents, and I love my spouse, and I love my children. But the feelings that come with that love are going to change, right? The feelings I have towards my spouse are not the same as the feelings I have towards my children. But insofar as I am freely choosing to lay down my life for them, I am loving them. Insofar as I become selfish and I'm not loving them, regardless of the feelings I have, okay? So love, the good, is inseparable from reason. Beauty is also inseparable from love and reason. And I want to put it this way, talking about St. Thomas Aquinas. We mentioned this, I think, briefly last night, I think. That if we have humility, our eyes will be opened to wonder. And with eyes of wonder, we'll be moved to contemplation. And when we move to contemplation, we will have the gift of dilatatio, of dilation, the opening of the mind and the heart and the soul to the reality that's there. And the reality that's there, of course, is God's presence in the reality. And that involves an engagement, wonder involves an engagement with the imagination. All right, and one way I put this is about orientation. We talked a lot yesterday about ad orientem. About the evangelizing power of beauty. If you get a Catholic, a Protestant, a Muslim, an atheist, an agnostic, and you put them in a field in the middle of the night, and you sit them down and you orientate them. In other words, you face them towards the east. At some point, the sun is going to rise. The light is going to change. You're going to actually see a beautiful panorama, a kaleidoscope of colours. Last night, by the way, one thing you've got to love about Kansas, that sunset last night blew me away. So you shouldn't be told about sunsets and sunrises if you live here. If you do, you're lacking that sense of humility and wonder, is all I can say. So as you see the sunrise, and I actually wrote a poem once called Solstice Sunrise, and this is a real occasion back in England. We get sunrises in England as well, you know. Did you know that? It's amazing. Even over there they have sunrises. It was midsummer. Now in England, in midsummer, the sun rises about 5 o'clock in the morning, very early, and it's getting light about an hour before that. So this is midsummer, and I was out, took a walk in the countryside by myself. The only other living thing, apart from vegetation, that I saw was a hare in the field. Just me and the hare and the rising of the sun. And the first thing that happened was that the sun came above the horizon. It was a disc of pure white. It looked like the host being elevated. Now, this for me was a gift, right? God is giving me this gift. And it rose white, you looked directly at it. And then at some point it turned red. And as it turned red, it sort of the redness spread across the sky. And then at some point it turned gold, and I couldn't look at it any longer. And the poem that I wrote analogizes that with the rosary. You know, the white are the joyful mysteries, the red are the sorrowful mysteries, and the gold are the glorious mysteries. So you have this experience of this sunrise, the elevation of the host. So, an understanding that we should, if you like, approach the sacred liturgy in the same way as we should approach something as glorious and full of the presence of God as that sunrise. We should approach it on our knees, in humility, with a spirit of wonder. And if we're not doing that, then we are not really participating in the liturgy on the level that we are meant to be, which springs from that sense of wonder, which is the fruit of humility. Now against that, Chesterton, I think I mentioned this last night, Chesterton back in 1931 gave a talk in North America, in Canada and the United States, called Culture and the Coming Peril. And he began that talk by saying, I expect you think that I'm going to say that the coming peril is Bolshevism. Now bear in mind, this is 1931, there was the Russian Revolution just 14 years earlier in Russia, and communism was spreading across Europe and indeed North America. It's about the time probably when communism, serious socialism, was probably at its most popular over here in the 1930s. And he said, I expect you think I'm going to be talking about the coming peril is Bolshevism. He says, but I don't think Bolshevism is the coming peril. He says, because the best way of destroying a utopia is to try it. Now that actually, it's easy for us now, 100 years on, to say, well, that's true and even obvious, but that's actually from him was prophecy. Because at that time, most people believed that communism was going to sweep across the world, and it was going to be the new order. And if the large reason for the rise of fascism was a reaction against that happening, right? Anything's better than communism, right? So you choose something which is equally bad in order to oppose it. But Chesterton says, no, the coming peril is standardization by a low standard. Right? Dumbing things down, vulgarization. And when we talk about the liturgy, certainly the way it went in the 1960s and 70s, that was what was actually happening to the liturgy. In sort of a wrong-headed idea that this is making more accessible to more people, it was dumbed down and vulgarized. Instead of being something which was beautiful, that should bring us to our knees, if not physically, at least spiritually, it became something which was vulgar. Actually ugly. And, from the perspective of the fact we love our Lord, embarrassing. That this is all that we can do for him? Is this how unimportant he is to us? And I mentioned last night also about, I travel a lot. And I mentioned yesterday that I'd never seen a church anywhere in the world as ugly as the church that's in my parish. And you're thinking, well, he's a hypocrite, why is he going there, right? Well, the good thing is we don't use that as our church anymore. It's sort of, it's like almost like an outbuilding. We have meetings and things there. We've actually built a beautiful new church, and that's where the liturgy is. But this thing outside, this eyesore, most parishioners call it the spaceship. I call it the washing machine agitator, because that's what it looks like. What were they thinking, quite frankly, when they were building that as a church? And I thought, well, it's actually quite good to be able to boast to people that my parish has the ugliest church in the United States. Until I went to a town in Washington. If I mentioned the name yesterday, you're under the seal of confessional, don't mention the name of the town again, because I don't want it to get back to people there. This is what I'm saying about the church. But I was driven to the church. We drove past it. I was driven down by a couple of sisters from another speaking engagement. And we drove past it a couple of times. We couldn't see it because it looked nothing like a church, and there was not even an obvious crucifix or something demarking it as a church. It was a corrugated iron, white-washed warehouse. Oh well, I found a church that's even uglier than the one that I've got in my own parish, and the liturgy within it. I went to the vigil mass on Saturday because I'd be spending all day Sunday travelling home. There were no kneelers, and nobody knelt at any point during the whole of the liturgy, not even at the consecration. I was the only person kneeling, and I'm English, and I sometimes say about the English that one of the things wrong with the English is that we abandoned the 10 commandments and replaced them with just one commandment: thou shalt not be impolite. So it doesn't come easy for an Englishman in that scenario to be the only person kneeling. Right? You just do as the Romans do, right? Except these people weren't doing as the Romans were doing. I was the only person doing as the Romans were doing, right? And so 2 big screens at the back. I can't even call them hymns. No songs that were written any earlier than the 1980s were sung. And it saddened me. Didn't anger me, but thanks be to God, I don't have a lot of anger left in me. I got that out of my system when I was young, and those of you that read my book, Race with the Devil, will understand that. So I don't anger, just sadness. And I felt sorry for the parishioners here that are just not being given anything else. And for many of them, it's all they know. No, they've basically been led into a desert. And then the following week, as Providence would have it, I gave a talk at St. John Cancius Church in Chicago, which was voted this year as the most beautiful church in the United States. And I actually believe in providence, right? I actually believe that God exists and things happen providentially. And for me, those 2 events happening one after the other in 2 subsequent weekends was God allowing me to see the difference. And this church, St. John Cancius, I don't know if you know anything about it, is a church built by Polish immigrants in Chicago. They were the poorest of the poor. They built it themselves with their own hands because they couldn't afford to pay people to build it. It's a beautiful church, and then during the 60s and 70s, which I'll come into in a moment, it fell into disrepair and was almost going to be pulled down. And one visionary priest decided he would make it his mission to have this church renovated to its original splendour, with the art and everything else. He did that, and other like-minded people gathered around him. There's now a new order of priests, all young, all dynamic. And I told the story yesterday about how on All Souls Day they have a full orchestral, sung, solemn, extraordinary form mass with Mozart's Requiem. And it's packed. This church holds hundreds and hundreds of people. They hear 500 confessions every weekend, by the way. And very dynamic as regards to the number of vocations. They offer mass in both forms, so they're not sort of trads in the exclusivist sense. But, so of course what happens at this is that half the people there, presumably more than half, but are there to worship. But a large number of people come for the concert, right? For the performance. You've got an orchestra and choir performing Mozart's Requiem Mass. But within the setting of a traditional mass with the priests in traditional black vestments for the requiem. Now you might say, well, I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that, right? So the whole back half of the church are there for a concert, and it's the sacred liturgy. But look at this as a witness, the power of beauty. They get a lot of goths going. You know what goths are as a youth cult? They look like zombies, right? They try to... well, this particularly, and it happens every year, they get goths coming. And this particular goth, looked like death warmed up, and that was what he was trying to look like. Worked out he was also a Satanist, was involved in a local satanic group. Came to this mass, had an instantaneous conversion experience. And this was just last year, and now he's a leading member of their young adults group. And when I was there was this beautiful woman in a long flowing robe, looked like something out of the Renaissance. Beatrice had come to visit me in Chicago, Dante's Beatrice. So I was sort of, awestruck at the beauty of this woman. And as I got closer to her, she had a really ugly tattoo around her neck. For all I know, she has tattoos on other parts of her body. Maybe that's one of the reasons she wears long flowing robes now, I don't know. But I spoke to her after she came to my tour. I spoke to her, and that same thing. She was a goth, angry, living a bad lifestyle, came to this church, had a conversion experience, and now is on fire with the Lord and a daily communicant. So the evangelizing power of beauty, and that's what I do most of the time. I give talks about some of the great works of literature of the Catholic cultural revival. Tolkien, Lewis, G.K. Chesterton, John Henry Newman, etc. So, yesterday I mentioned the Second Spring, and I do see parallels between what happened in England in the latter half of the 19th century, following the conversion of Blessed John Henry Newman, and what's happening in the church today. So I want to talk about that, and I want to begin by just quoting a little bit from Newman's sermon on the Second Spring. So of course, the idea of the Second Spring is that the church had basically been illegal in England for 300 years. It had almost been exterminated through relentless persecution, 150 years of martyrdoms and 150 years of just legal second-class citizen status. So there are only a few thousands, tens of thousands maybe, Catholics left in the whole of England. This courageous remnant of recusants. And we should give appropriate reverence to these people. They'd clung to the faith for 300 years, passing it on to the next generation in a country which despised them. But they were all that were left, and you could have said, okay, well, it's all over. England as a Catholic nation is dead. You might lament 1,000 years of Catholicism. The first English martyr, St. Alban, was killed under the Romans, and going right through to Henry VIII's apostasy and Caesar establishing himself as head of the church. 1,000 years. But now, 300 years later, it's dead. To all intents and purposes, it's dead. But we believe in a God, as Chesterton said, that found his way out of the grave. And in 1845, two things happened. One, John Henry Newman was received into the Catholic Church. He was revered for his eloquence, for his brilliance as a theologian, as a philosopher, as a preacher, as a writer, as a prose stylist. And he was predicting, everyone thought he was going to go to the higher you can get, basically, Archbishop of Canterbury or what have you. And then he becomes a Catholic. It sends shockwaves through the English establishment. And then becomes actually fashionable. That's always dangerous when something becomes fashionable. Fashionable to become Catholic. And higher echelons, blue-blooded aristocrats were becoming Catholic, and intellectuals were becoming Catholic, and poets were becoming Catholics. Imagine this conversation, that Lord so-and-so has poped, Oh, really? Yes, well, old so-and-so poped with his wife, Lady so-and-so last week. Everyone seems to be poping these days. So if you like, you had the higher echelons, it's now becoming fashionable to convert to Catholicism. And at the same time, 1845 is also the year of the Irish potato famine. And so you have this exodus of people from Ireland. Obviously, many of them came over here, but many of them also went to England. So you had this Catholic working class, this Catholic proletariat, and this new Catholic intellectual conversions going on. And this was the beginning, and I think Newman, obviously the potato famine as well, but Newman was a major catalyst for that. 4 years later, in 1850, the English hierarchy is re-established after obviously being destroyed by Henry VIII over 300 years earlier. And this is what Newman says in his sermon a couple of years after that. A great change, an awful contrast between the time-honoured church of St. Augustine and St. Thomas and the poor remnant of their children in the beginning of the 19th century. He's talking about St. Augustine of Canterbury, who brought the faith to England, sent by Gregory the Great, not St. Augustine of Hippo, and this would probably be St. Thomas of Becket, not St. Thomas the Apostle or St. Thomas Aquinas, I'm guessing. Time on the church of St. Augustine, St. Thomas, and the poor remnant of their children in the beginning of the 19th century. It was a miracle, I might say, to have pulled down that lordly power. But there was a greater and a truer one in store. No one could have prophesied its fall, but still less would anyone have ventured to prophesy its rise again. The inspired word seems to imply the almost impossibility of such a grace as the renovation of those who have crucified to themselves again and trodden underfoot the Son of God. Who then could have dared to hope that, out of so sacrilegious a nation as this, a people would have been formed again unto their Saviour? Apart from anything else, of course, beautiful prose. Newman is one of the finest writers in the English language. Newman wrote a novel at the time of his conversion, it would have been published by the time he gave this sermon, called Loss and Gain, one of the great Victorian novels about conversion to the Catholic faith. I recommend it. It seemed to be a time when leading churchmen in the Catholic Church thought it was one of the things they did as being bishops and cardinals was to write novels. So Cardinal Wiseman, at around the same time, I think about 1848, that sort of time, wrote a novel called Fabiola, A Tale of the Catacombs. Newman wrote a book called Callista, a sketch of the 3rd century. So these leading churchmen were all novelists in those days. But this is what a part of Cardinal Wiseman's novel about the catacombs. We need not remind our readers that the office then performed, in other words the Mass, that the office then performed was essentially and in many details the same as the daily witness at the Catholic altar. Not only was it considered, as now, to be the sacrifice of our Lord's body and blood, not only were the oblation, the consecration, the communion alike, but many of the prayers were identical, so that the Catholic hearing them recited, and still more the priest reciting them in the same language as the Roman Church of the Catacombs spoke, may feel himself in active and living communion with the martyrs who celebrated and the martyrs who assisted at those sublime mysteries. Okay, so the liturgy, as described by Cardinal Wiseman in his novel. Now I'm going to now come forward, because very, very briefly, the impact of that Catholic cultural revival in England. So from the death of the faith to this resurrection, the second spring, we have numerous, and I write about the 20th century aspect of it in this book, Literary Converts, but it begins really in Newman's time. Countless converts to the Catholic faith from all walks of life. Now, as regards writers, Chesterton, Oscar Wilde, Gerard Manley Hopkins, into the 20th century, Evelyn Waugh, Graham Greene. Now, so some of the greatest works of the English language have sprung from this second spring. Brideshead Revisited, for me, is the greatest novel of the 20th century. A wonderful work. If you haven't read it, you should, about a Catholic family. The word brideshead, by the way, the bride's head, right? Christ. So the actual the house in the story is a metaphor for the church. And then the Lord of the Rings. I don't know if I do a lot of talks on the Lord of the Rings, but that is the most popular work of literature ever written. That's a sweeping statement, but I can back it up. Well, apart from lots of opinion polls where people voted, not just in England, but in the United States and Australia and other countries in Europe, as the most popular book. But in terms of sales, the biggest selling works of literature of all time, in first place is Don Quixote by Miguel Cervantes. Second place is A Tale of Two Cities by Dickens. And third is The Lord of the Rings. The Hobbit is sixth, and Lion, Witch and the Wardrobe is 11th. These spring from this second spring. Now, the reason I say that, for those of you that are logical now, saying, hang on for a second, he's just said it's the most popular work of all time, now he's just said it's the third most popular work of all time, he's contradicting himself. I would say, and I think it could not be argued against, that 80% at least of the people that read Don Quixote do so under compulsion. Right? It's a set text at school, you will read it, and you will be tested on it. The same thing can be said of Tale of Two Cities. It is the work by Dickens that's always on the curricula at high schools. 80% of people who read The Lord of the Rings, Tale of Two Cities do so under compulsion. The Lord of the Rings is hardly ever taught at school. People went out and bought it because they wanted to read it of their own free will. Now, Tolkien's was what I call a cradle convert. It's not a contradiction in terms, not a cradle Catholic, not a convert, because his mother converted to Catholicism under the benign influence of the ghost of Newman, insofar as she attended Mass at the Birmingham Oratory, which Newman had founded, and she was attending Mass there at the turn of the 20th century, so within 10 years of Newman's death, Father Francis Morgan, who would become Tolkien's legal guardian following the death of his mother, his father was already dead, knew Newman personally. So it's under the influence, the benign influence of Newman's disciples, and we might say the ghost of Newman himself, that Mabel Tolkien, Tolkien's mother, received into the church and has both of her sons received into the church as boys. Tolkien remains a lifelong practicing Catholic. The Lord of the Rings is, in his own words, The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. So the most popular work of literature of all time came out of this second spring. Now, what I want to say now is that to look at that and look at the situation in the 1960s and 1970s, particularly as regards to liturgy, and an understanding that it's as if the liturgy of the church had died. That's a very sweeping statement. But certainly that's what many people felt at the time, and it's difficult for us, in what quite frankly are happier times for the church, to really see the desolation that many people felt in the 1960s and 70s. So I'm going to just read some comments by some well-known people at the time. So this is Robert Speight, the biographer of Hilaire Belloc, amongst other things, a well-known actor. The actual achievement of the council seems to me the greatest single event of my lifetime, the most unexpected and the most fertile in promise. Talking about the Second Vatican Council, of course. My sympathies were wholeheartedly with the progressive majority. Something has happened far beyond the intention of the Conciliar Fathers and their attendant periti. The psychology of adherence to Catholicism has subtly changed. Authority is flouted, basic doctrines are questioned, and the boundaries of what is understood by the Church are almost indefinitely extended. The vernacular liturgy, popular and pedestrian, intelligible and depressing, has robbed us of much that was numinous in public worship. There is less emphasis on prayer and penitence, and the personal relationship between God and man is neglected in favour of a diffused social concern. Ultimately, Spate's initial enthusiasm, I'm reading from the book here, ultimately Spate's initial enthusiasm gave way to indignant exasperation. What exasperates me in the attitude of many progressives is not their desire to go forward or even to change direction, but their indifference to tradition, which is the terra firma from which they themselves proceed. And Sir Alec Guinness, we all know Sir Alec Guinness, if for no other reasons because we watched Star Wars, he's much better than that. Plays Father Brown in a very good adaptation of Chesterton's character. And this is Sir Alec Guinness. Much water has flown under Tiber's bridges, carrying away splendour and mystery from Rome since the pontificate of Pius XII. The essentials, I know, remain firmly entrenched, and I find the post-conciliar Mass simpler and generally better than a Tridentine. But the banality and vulgarity of the translations which have ousted the sonorous Latin and Little Greek are of a supermarket quality. That's grocery store if you're not bilingual. Supermarket quality, which is quite unacceptable. Handshaking and embarrassed smiles or smirks have replaced the older courtesies. Kneeling is out, queuing is in, and the general tone is rather like a BBC radio broadcast for tiny tots. The Church has proved she is not moribund. All shall be well, I feel, and all manner of things shall be well, so long as the God who is worshipped is the God of all ages, past and to come, and not the idol of modernity, so venerated by some of our bishops, priests, and miniskirted nuns. Speaking of miniskirted nuns, by the way, and going from maybe the sublime to the partially ridiculous, I was raised as someone who idolised. I wasn't raised in a Christian home particularly at all. They never went to church or anything. But I was raised to idolise Elvis Presley. And I was very pleased to manage to take my mum on the pilgrimage to Graceland before she died. But there was Elvis's last movie, which made in 1969, at exactly the height of all this stuff, is something called Change of Habit. And in it, Elvis, there are 3 habited nuns who arrive in a ghetto in New York. And of course, one of them falls in love with Elvis, that's inevitable, right? But by the end of the movie, the black sister has basically become a radical black pride activist and has left the order to work for racial justice or what have you. One of them leaves in order to presumably eventually marry Elvis, and one goes back in her habit to the convent, but with the hope that she can also wear miniskirts soon. And the movie ends with Elvis. This is the Mass, right? And this is 1969, okay? So it's only a few years after the changes in the liturgy from the Tridentine Mass. Elvis is singing basically a rock and roll song called Let Us Pray, and swinging and swaying with black gospel singers swaying as the gifts are being brought up to the altar for Mass. And it's difficult for us to even, and of course I loved all that when I was a kid. I had no idea what Mass was anyway. Elvis was more important to me than God, so in fact Elvis was God, so it didn't really matter. Because I see things somewhat differently now. But you can just imagine what people at the time, those that had been raised as Catholics and had spent 20 or 30, 40 years of their lives with the solemnity of the liturgy, being affronted with this revolutionary change. So last night I read the letter that was sent to the Times by a whole host of celebrities. I won't read it again, but if any of you weren't here last night, I'd like to see it, come and see me and I will show you the letter, 4 paragraphs. But basically what we see here is the secular world. Great artists, well, famous people. I mentioned some of them that people would know. Agatha Christie was perhaps the best known Yehudi Menuhin, Iris Murdoch, Malcolm Muggeridge, and many others, dozens of names, Graham Greene. But basically what these secular people were doing was accusing the church of scandalous vandalism of the common heritage of all of humanity in abandoning the Mass. So, talking about how it's inspired great works of art, great works of music. So I'll just read the last paragraph, perhaps. The signatories of this appeal, which is entirely ecumenical and non-political, have been drawn from every branch of modern culture in Europe and elsewhere. They wish to call to the attention of the Holy See the appalling responsibility it would incur in the history of the human spirit were it to refuse to allow the traditional Mass to survive, even though this survival took place side by side with other liturgical forms. And what I write in my book here, as a comment upon this letter, in an ironic role reversal, these plaintive voices seem to represent a secular David defending sacred tradition against the Goliath-like power of the Catholic hierarchy, who had cast themselves in the role of Philistines. Certainly an irony there. I want to talk a little bit now about... no, maybe I don't. Maybe I don't. I think I'm going to talk about in general about Evelyn Waugh's response to the changes. It desolated him. What was happening to liturgy, and there's a long correspondence that's been published between him and Cardinal Heenan at the time. And Cardinal Heenan seemed to be sympathetic to the tradition-oriented approach of Evelyn Waugh, but seemed to be able to do nothing against the tide that was sweeping through the church at the time. And at the end of his life, 1966, I think, he got permission at Easter Sunday to have a traditional Mass said. And he had to have permission, and it was just him and his family, a small private Mass. He went to confession. He'd basically been in a state of desolate despondency for a couple of years because of the changes. Went to confession on the Saturday, went to traditional liturgy on Easter Sunday, came back home, and everyone remarked on how happy he looked, as if a great weight had been removed from his shoulders. And an hour or so after he returned from Easter Sunday Mass, he died. Now, no one's going to say that Evelyn Waugh lived an exemplary life as a Christian. I don't think we can expect Evelyn Waugh to be canonised. But as with Oscar Wilde, we can safely predict he's in heaven, because Oscar Wilde was receiving the church on his deathbed, receiving the last rites, the forgiveness of our Lord. And Evelyn Waugh had just come back from Mass, feeling happy, having confessed his sins the day before, and then it's taken away. And a great act of mercy on the part of our Lord. This theme, once again, of death and resurrection. What Evelyn Waugh said in one of his letters, I can't believe that I will live to see things righted. In other words, what's happened, this revolution that's happened, is permanent. There's no sign of a resurrection. And yet this is the fall, right? The world in which we live reflects the truth of the God who made it. We have the fall, the dying, we have the winter, the death, we have the spring, the resurrection. We have every day the night, the death, and the dawn, the resurrection. And I think what we're seeing in the last 30 years or so, probably, and we want to put a date upon it, perhaps we can say, for the sake of wanting to give a date, the election of St. John Paul II, 1978, turning of the tide and the resurrection of the sacred liturgy. So one or two things just before I finish, in defence of Latin within the liturgy. Because there's a paradox that Chesterton would delight in. I'm going to read Chesterton on this in a moment. That why living languages in the liturgy are deadly, and dead languages are alive. And that's because you can kill the living, but you can't kill the dead. And this is what Chesterton has to say in his book, The Thing. But while I see what there is to be said for the cult of the vernacular, the Protestant critic does not see what there is to be said for the fixed form of the classic tongue. He does not see that there is something to be said even for the general idea that Catholic poetry should be in the vernacular, like the Divine Comedy, and Catholic worship in the fundamental language, like the Mass. It is a question between a dead language and a dying language. Every living language is a dying language, even if it does not die. Parts of it are perpetually perishing or changing their sense. There is only one escape from that flux, and a language must die to be immortal. The start of the English Jacobean translation is as noble and simple a thing as any in the world. Some of the King James Bible, obviously. But even there, the words degenerate. It's not their fault, but ours who misuse them. But they are misused. No language could lift itself into a loftier or simpler strain than that which begins, comfort ye, my people. But even then, when we pass on to speak ye comfortably to Jerusalem, we stumble over a word we have vulgarized, comfortably. But the world plays havoc with all such words, whether they are in the English Bible or the Latin canon. There are many words of Catholic usage which have in practice been thus misused. When an outsider hears that a Catholic has refrained from something for fear of causing scandal, he instantly has an irritated impression that it means a fear of setting all the silly old women in the town talking gossip. Of course, it means nothing of the kind. It does not mean that in Greek, it does not mean that in Latin, it ought not to mean that in English. It ought to mean what it says, the fear of tripping somebody up, of putting a stumbling block in the way of some struggling human being. Well, so the idea about meaning, words are slippery, they change. The word nice, for instance, the word nice. If you'd said have a nice day to the author of the Beowulf poem, he'd have punched you in the nose. Because nice meant nasty in Old English. Even in Middle English, if you said the same thing, have a nice day to Chaucer, he'd punch you in the nose. The modern equivalent of the word nice is that original meaning is nicius, which means nasty. By Shakespeare's time, it meant fastidious, where we get the word nicety. So it's not a particularly good thing even then. Just have a nice day to Shakespeare, he wouldn't have been very pleased. So the point is that when we have a so-called living language, which is also a dying and decaying language, we have a dying and decaying liturgy, which has to be permanently repainted like a bridge, so it doesn't rot. So you need to have new translations all the time. And of course, in the extent to which that the language is decaying, the dumbing down, the vulgarization, the standardization by a low standard, the liturgy will decay with the decay of the language. How can it not? So for instance, Ronald Knox, God bless him, his idea of his translation of the Bible was to write it, to translate it from the Vulgate, from the Latin, into what he called a timeless English. It was a quixotic quest, because there's no such thing as a timeless English. And particularly in a globalized culture where it's becoming the common language of business around the world, the decay is accelerating. Knox also said, by the way, and I may have mentioned this last night, I can't remember, I know I mentioned it in conversation over dinner, that in the 1950s he was going to perform a baptism, and the parents of the child said, would he mind doing the baptism in English so that they could understand it? And Knox responded, you understand English, but the devil understands Latin. We'll do it in Latin. And the irony, of course, is that the King James Version of the Bible and the Douay-Rheims Version of the Bible are actually, because they're archaic, are more alive. because we have to put ourselves back in time and to understand the language in those terms in order to understand it. And that forces us to raise our game, to edify ourselves in order to actually comprehend. The paradox is the archaic is more alive the more it's dead. All right, I'm going to end there because I want to make sure we have time for questions. I'm going to give you a little anecdote about Ad Orientem before I do go. Back in England, I became a Catholic in 1989, so it should be the 1990s in England. And there was basically one priest in the town of Ipswich that still said the traditional mass, diocesan priest, and he was allowed the indult. But the parish next door, the pastor of that parish, sort of made some snide remark at mass. He says that I'm pleased that you'd rather spend mass looking at me rather than staring at Father so-and-so's backside. Now, someone relayed this to the priest himself. So at the beginning of the traditional mass, he said, I'm really pleased that some of you prefer staring at my backside to the face of so-and-so. Now, this lacks charity, and I'm not holding it up as an example, but the point is neither of them got it right. It's not about staring at the priest at all. It's about facing the Lord together, priest and faithful together, facing the same way in the sacrifice of the Mass and adoration of our Lord and God. And I'm going to finish with some words of Tolkien about the Blessed Sacrament. Out of the darkness of my life, so much frustrated, I put before you the one great thing to love on earth, the Blessed Sacrament. There you will find romance, glory, honour, fidelity, and the true way of all your loves on earth. And more than that, death. By the divine paradox, that which ends life and demands the surrender of all, and yet by the taste or foretaste of which alone can what you seek in your earthly relationships, love, faithfulness, joy, be maintained, or take on that complexion of reality, of eternal endurance, which every man's heart desires. Thank you very much.